Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Live. I'm your host, Aaron Tomlinson. I'm going to give it a second to breathe here, see if some people jump on, check some settings, make sure I'm actually streaming. So give me just a second, please. If you're watching by replay, I appreciate you watching. Let's see. Go ahead and share this to the group real quick. I'll have to change the settings. I don't know why it doesn't show like public setting when I do this. But it'll give people that are friends with me a chance to catch it on New Day Global and watching by YouTube. So great to have everybody with me today. And I want to talk to you about how to connect with spiritual reality, unseen reality, whether it's ancestors, spirit guides, higher self, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, whatever camp you find yourself in, you're going to find the same principles at work. Now, I've talked about this a lot. I've talked about my belief in the reality of the spiritual world, the importance of spirituality, the psychological and mental health benefits of spirituality. And usually after those videos, I get comments, people saying, okay, that's great, but how do we do this? And I have to admit that's a little bit frustrating for me, even though I understand, because from my perspective, in those videos, I do share the how to. However, I realize that everybody has different learning styles. I tend to lean pretty heavily towards what's called a global learning style. So essentially, when in theories of education and stuff like this, we look at two primary learning styles. The first one that I mentioned is global. The second one is sequential. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference of those two things. Now, most of us are a blend of both of those learning styles. Only about 15% of the population can only learn from a presentation that is sequential. About 23%, they estimate, can only learn if they think in global terms. And the rest of us are a mixture of both learning styles, somewhere in the middle. I know that's certainly true for me, but I lean pretty heavily towards global learning. So what's the difference? In global learning, a person who's a global learner tends to look for the big picture. They don't look for steps necessarily. They kind of can take information when you're in a global learning style, take that information and kind of figure out the steps later on, or the steps or the principles as you're going. And in fact, someone who leans heavily to global learning style, which I tend to do, can get very frustrated with sequential teaching. By the same token, people who lean more towards the sequential learning style, which is a sequential learning style is ordered numerically. So step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and each step kind of building upon the other, or principles. Most of us learn to take notes. If you're my age, at least, I don't know how they teach it today with all the technology and everything, but back when I was in school, we had to learn how to take notes while we were listening to a presentation or a lecture, right? And most of us were taught to take notes in some kind of an outline style. So, and if you ever had to write papers, you usually had to have an outline for your paper, and it had to be sequential. So you have a main point, then you have 3 points underneath that, and then you have subpoints underneath each point. That's a sequential style of taking notes. There's another way of taking notes that I find more helpful for me, and that's sort of mind mapping, or mapping out the lecture. So rather than taking it in an outline sequential style, I will kind of write the main note, excuse me, on the paper, maybe circle it. And then if a thought connects to it, I'll draw a line to it and write that thought down. So at the end of the day, you have more of a collage or more of a mind map type notes to jar your memory and to help you learn. So what I thought I would do today is talk about this because because I am more of a global learner, I tend to be more of a prancer, meaning I just kind of prance around from here to here to here and don't necessarily keep things in a sequential order. And that can be very frustrating for people, not just people who are um, totally locked into sequential learning, but also people who are somewhere in the middle. Sometimes we need that sequential presentation to help things connect for us. So I want to do this sequentially this morning. But before I do that, just kind of introduce the topic. Why do I think I can talk about this, et cetera, and so on. And just talk about where these principles come from, not just from my own personal experience, but also from my personal learning and study, and really 30 years or more of doing this, connecting with spirit and spiritual realities, being relatively experienced in supernatural phenomenon, encountering supernatural phenomenon, everything from healing to channeling to guidance to synchronicities or answers to prayer, law of attraction, however you want to understand those things. But I had someone recently ask me when my deconstruction journey began. And that's a question I've really had to think about, because for most people it is a journey, deconstructing from something, any belief system, any group that you're a part of, anything that you're dogmatically committed to that perhaps isn't the full truth or isn't the truth at all. As we grow and as we change and as we transform, we tend to go through deconstruction phases where, certainly I don't believe the same things I believed 30 years ago in terms of doctrine and faith and cosmologies and things like this. However, I have been able to be committed to a core set of principles. So what does the deconstruction in this core set of principles have in common? One of the things that happened to me when I first started pastoring, go back to the summer of 2000, July of 2000, I'm taking a vacation. I'm in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, sitting on the beach, enjoying the vacation. And I had been pastoring since that Easter. So I think Easter that year was in April. And that's when we started our church. And so I'd only been doing this for a few months and I was brand new to it. And I was trying to learn how to be a pastor, how to build church, how to do ministry, all of this stuff in this new capacity that I had. And I had learned how to engage Christ or Jesus through my imagination. And I'll be talking about that as a principle a little bit later, because it's one of the principles sequentially that we'll go through. And so I was just laying there on the beach and I just would make a picture, open up that imaginal realm, that imaginal capacity within me. And in this particular experience, I saw a figure, Jesus, that was walking towards me and carrying a shepherd's staff, dressed like traditionally we would think a shepherd would look like from the time period in which Jesus lived, carrying, the staff with the hook on it and carrying a tiny little lamb in his arms. And in this experience, Jesus was approaching me and I could see this little lamb. Now, keep in mind, the word pastor, for those of you that don't know, the word pastor is an old English word that simply means shepherd. It's only used one time in the Bible, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. And yet that seems to be the title that is still popular today, that people gravitate towards, et cetera, and so on. So as I'm seeing Jesus in this role of the great shepherd, the great pastor, I'm thinking about my identity and myself as a shepherd. And so I think in this experience that Jesus is approaching me as a shepherd and desiring for me or showing me something about caring for the sheep, right? Caring for the little lambs. And this little lamb had a wound in its side, just a small wound with a little bit of blood that I could see. And Jesus takes this lamb and he hands it to me. Now, again, as he's handing me this lamb, I'm thinking to myself, this is a message from God. This is a message from heaven telling me that I'm to take care of the little sheep or take care of the wounded sheep. And so I take this lamb in the experience into my arms. And when I did that, all of this hurt and pain that I had been carrying from various different experiences that I'd gone through in my still relatively young life all came rushing to the surface. Stuff that I didn't even know was there. So most of you have heard my testimony, how in 2016, I had another experience similar to this, although it didn't involve Jesus, but where this trauma from things that I experienced in my youth came rushing to the surface. This was sort of related to that. And prior to this time, I was supercharged in what you might call the faith message. In other words, I believed that, the mantra that comes from a evangelist, late 19th, early 20th century evangelist by the name of Smith Wigglesworth, an Englishman, an English plumber who had a evangelistic ministry that spanned the globe. And there are many, many, many stories of incredible signs and wonders and miracles, New Testament type, Book of Acts type stuff that happened with Smith Wigglesworth. And he coined the phrase or the saying, I'm not moved by what I see. I'm not moved by what I feel. I'm only moved by what I believe. And then Campus Crusade for Christ had this little diagram where they had a train, and they had truth as the engine that was driving the train, or facts. Then they had faith hooked up next, and the caboose was your feelings. And so the approach to life, the approach to living out life by faith, living by faith, the Bible says the just shall live by faith, was that we would have the truth revealed to us, usually through the scriptures, and then we would have to apply faith to that truth and ignore whatever it was that we were feeling. And so one of my favorite Bible verses at the time comes from the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says, for if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old things have passed away and all things have become new. And so for me, that was the engine, right? That was the facts or the truth. I'm a new creation in Christ. The old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And I took that to mean that all of the feelings and trauma and negative experiences that I'd had from my past life had passed away. I didn't have to identify with them. I didn't have to feel them or experience them or deal with them in any way. All I had to do was stay connected to the engine. The caboose, which is the feelings, could, get disconnected, and you're still good because you got faith and you got the truth. And for me, the truth was I was a new creation. And then in Philippians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says, forgetting those things that are behind, I press on towards those things that are ahead of me. So I didn't want to have to deal with the past. I didn't want to have to deal with any unpleasant feelings. I didn't want to have to deal with any kind of traumas. And yet those things were still inside of me. So I had completely denied those. I had completely shut off my feelings. I had deliberately put out of my mind and attention anything that had to do with traumatic experiences or painful experiences that I had experienced from my past. And when I take this lamb, I realize that I'm not the shepherd in this scenario. I'm not being told to care for a little lamb. It was a little bit of a wound to my ego, to be honest, because here I am, this baby lamb, this tiny, almost newborn looking lamb. And we did raise sheep when I was growing up. So I know a little bit about sheep and raising sheep. And so I know this was a very, very small, very young lamb that was being handed to me. And I realized I was the wounded lamb. I was the lamb with the wound in the side. And when I had this experience and I took this lamb to myself, all of this stuff opened up on the inside. And it was so overwhelming for me in that moment that I became very emotional and really stayed in an emotional place, very disrupted, disorganized, internally disorganized space for a number of months after that, as I tried to work through the pain and the trauma and tried to do it by myself. Back then, we definitely, coming from the Christian perspective, we didn't believe in mental health. We didn't believe in counseling, depression, anxiety, any of that stuff. We didn't address it. We didn't believe in it. We didn't think a Christian should have that. You should only have joy. You should only have peace that passes understanding. You should be bringing forth fruit of the Spirit. If you didn't experience those things that we called the fruit of the Spirit, like love, like joy, like peace, like patience, etc., and so on, then you were a carnal Christian. You were a carnal believer. You were a babe in Christ, or you were immature, whatever the case may be. And so something really broke inside of me when I had that experience. And this is one of the reasons that I'm a little bit touchy. And one of the things I really had to wrestle through and work through in my personal life as I was going through deconstruction process, particularly as people were presenting me with the more atheist arguments and the more scientific materialist arguments, kind of anti-spirituality, anti-anything spiritual, anti-relating to anything invisible that might be out there. And so someone would say, well, that experience that you had was just something that you manufactured in your mind. And it makes a certain amount of sense. And to a certain degree, I did. However, what's significant about these types of experiences, and really important for us, is that if I had manufactured this myself, if this was something that was coming from my mind and coming from my ego, then one could naturally assume that it would confirm my own biases, that it would confirm to me my bias was, oh, I just became a pastor and a shepherd. Jesus is coming to me as a shepherd. Therefore, he's telling me to take care of the little wounded sheep. That was my bias. That's how my ego was thinking, if you will. And when I took hold of that lamb, and all of a sudden I realized, no, I'm not the shepherd in this scenario. I'm the lamb in this scenario. And all this pain, all this shadow self that I didn't want to deal with, this shadow work that I didn't know what to do with. Nobody was even talking about shadow work back then. And this is, 2000. So really didn't know a lot about the internet. I'm sure we were still using dial-up back then. You remember the old AOL, and the phone would have a busy signal and all that stuff. And this was certainly before Amazon podcasts and any of that stuff. So I didn't even know what shadow work was. I hadn't gone to school yet. I hadn't studied psychology. I hadn't studied mental health. I didn't know about any of that stuff, right? But what was happening to me in that scenario was that my shadow self was being exposed to me. And it was contradicting everything that I, up to that point, had believed. So that becomes a problem if people want to assume that it's just something that I created in my own mind. There was some kind of intervention in there that quite literally was life-changing for me. Now, through that summer and that fall, going back to 2000, and I hadn't even been pastoring but a few months, I began to become very disillusioned with evangelicalism and even, faith teachings that I had been exposed to, or the charismatic movement or the Pentecostal movement. Some of you may or may not know what that is. Some of you may be able to relate to this. But I had realized that really early on that the modern church must have gotten something wrong about the message of Jesus. And I would go to these so-called spirit-filled churches, and they really only operated in two of the spiritual gifts that are mentioned. Speaking in tongues, which I plan on doing another video on speaking in tongues for people in the future, and what we called back then prophecy, which really was sort of a form of channeling, saying the Lord is speaking to me these things. And the interesting thing is that those gifts are pretty easy to fake. Anybody can say they're speaking for God and just be creating stuff that's coming out of their own mind or out of their own imagination. That's a real thing. And I suppose someone could fake speaking in tongues by just talking baby talk gibberish or something like that. But there really wasn't any healing presence in any of the churches that I was seeing. There wasn't, if you read the Bible, if you look at the ministry of Jesus, Jesus primarily, and this is what I think gets lost in religion, and I think it gets lost in Bible scholarship, I think it gets lost in theology. But if you had to identify the person of Jesus as the stories are told in the Gospels that have come down to us in the Bible, Jesus was primarily a healer. Primarily a healer. In one place, he says that he was sent to seek and to save that which was lost. In another place, he says that the Son of Man, referring to himself, did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that through him the world might be saved. Now, evangelicalism takes that term save when he says, I came to seek and save that which was lost. Or anytime we see the word saved, I did not come to condemn the world, but to save the world. And we frame that in a modern understanding of heaven and hell and some kind of what we would have called back then a born-again experience, a salvation experience, something like that. And yet in the Greek, the word is sozo. And if you look up the definition of the word sozo in the Greek, where it says saved, he came to seek and to save, or he came to save and not condemn, it's the word that means healing. It literally means physical healing. In fact, there are several places in the New Testament where the word is not translated as save, but it's translated as heal. So Jesus said of himself that his ministry, his mission, was primarily one of healing. In another place, he says that those that are well do not need a physician, but those who are sick. And then he says, I came to call the sinners, not the righteous, but I came to call the sinners to repentance, which means that he frames his entire mission as a healing mission, his identity as a physician. And he heals the entire sin issue, whatever that is, or based on what the scriptures say, as a healing mission. He puts it under a healing paradigm, not a legal punishment paradigm. And so I began to see these things very, very early in the ministry and as I was leading the church and stuff like this. And I began to realize that when it came to real relationship, when it came to real spirituality, the church by and large, as it existed in 2000, and I would argue as it still exists 25 years later, was completely clueless, did not have a clue about spirituality. People in the faith movement would talk about healing, but they couldn't manifest healing miracles. They would talk about prosperity, but everybody was broke. They would talk about victorious living, and yet in people's daily personal lives, they weren't experiencing anything that was being taught from the platform. And so they were doing this sort of mental trickery with themselves where they were trying to believe what they were being taught, but there was a huge disconnect between what I would have called back then revelation, the revelation of the truth, or what we thought was the truth back then, and manifestation, the ability to walk that out, or the how to. And I was determined to discover the how. So one of the first things that I did was I thought, well, we must have gotten it wrong. So we need to go back to the early church. So I began to read early church fathers. I began to read, study the first few centuries of Christianity. And I discovered pretty early on that there was a fourth century group called the Desert Fathers that renounced life in this world. They are the original Christian monks. They went out into the deserts in Egypt and they sought mystical experience. And I began to see that the primary message, the core of real Christianity, if we want to call it that, in the early centuries was a mystical experience. And mysticism, it's where we get the word mystery. Mysticism or mystical involves engagement with unseen forces, particularly with God, and seeks union with God or experiential knowledge of God. So experience then in the spirit becomes primary, not last. For all that time in the church, experience didn't matter because faith was all that mattered. I'm not moved by what I see. I'm not moved by what I feel. I'm only moved by what I believe. And yet what I see and what I feel determines my experience more so than what I intellectually agree with or assent to. And so as I got more into mysticism and reading those kinds of things, I began to read metaphysical books. I think the first Greg Braden book that I read back in 2000. I think it was called The Isaiah Effect. And I would I would do it secretly because, this was supposed to get us demonized back then. But I would read books about shamanism. I would read books about metaphysics. I would read books about the new physics and stuff like this. And I would take that information and I would try to understand the gospel message through that lens. But more importantly, I began to realize that it was the New Agers, it was the shaman, it was the not Christian mystics who understood the principles of the spiritual world, who understood the principles of the unseen world and how a person can contact that and how a person can develop a relationship in that and experience those things. And as I began to build that into my life, I began to lead a church through a place where it wasn't just revelation without experience or revelation without manifestation, where we would talk about healing and see healing supernaturally and see miracles, where we would talk about finances and people would experience intervention miraculously in their finances, where we would talk about victory and principles that will allow people to apply these principles to their lives. We moved away from just, speaking in tongues and prophecy into other gifts of spirit that are mentioned but nobody talks about, like a word of knowledge, the ability to know something about someone through psychic perception that is accurate and detailed, not generalized and not manipulated, but information that comes as a download that's accurate and detailed about specific situations that people were facing in their lives. And not only did I start to operate in these things, but I began to teach people in our church about these things. And then as other pastors and ministers would come in and they would see and experience what we were experiencing in our church, I started getting invitations to go out to other places within the country and even internationally to teach and train teams of people on how to connect with these things. And so what I've realized after almost 10 years of deconstruction and going through this process, that those same principles are still true and still work today. And back then we thought these things were happening because of our right beliefs about the gospel, our right beliefs about Jesus, our right beliefs about the Spirit, et cetera, and so on. But as I began to deconstruct from those beliefs, some of them, like the doctrine of original sin, the doctrine of penal substitution, that God had to kill his son in order to forgive us. Of course, I deconstructed from the rapture and end times and all of that actually in the late 90s. But what I began to realize was that all these things were happening because they're natural to us as human beings and a natural part of the world in which we live. And what we believe at a what I would call a doctrinal level was really not primary at all, really not the most important thing at all. It was very, very much secondary, and began to discover, because I kept experiencing these things, deconstruct from penal substitution, deconstruct from really Jesus as any kind of savior in the traditional sense, even questioning the historical existence, the historical veracity of the Bible, to the point of even wondering about the historical existence, the real existence of a historical Jesus, and yet still experiencing spiritual encounters that were profitable, that were beneficial, that were healing, that were empowering, that were always to my benefit and the benefit of others around me, and very seldom, if ever, to any kind of a detriment there. And as I got more involved in the intellectual realm, as I got more involved in the scholarly realm, as I got more involved in the left brain side of things, if you will, I began to experience those things less and less. So let's come back. So that just gives you a little bit of background. Let's come back to some of the basic principles. And I'm going to just outline a few for you. If you're saying, I want to connect, I believe in God, I believe in spirit, I believe in ancestors and spirit guides and angels, and maybe you still believe in Jesus. Maybe you don't believe in Jesus. That's really not, it really doesn't matter. The principles are the same. And you say, but I want to know how. How do I connect? So I'm going to give you some principles, not necessarily steps in any kind of order of importance, or do this, then do this, then do this, in that kind of a sequential way. But sequentially, I want to lay out for you in a sequential teaching sort of way some principles and talk about those for the next few minutes here. So the first one I talk about a lot, but it's super important, probably is the foundation or the first step, and that is belief. You have to have belief if you're going to have experience, because the truth is the way our brains work, the way our sensory faculties work that allow input into us so that we can have experiences is shaped and controlled to a large extent by our beliefs. So in a very real sense, you will often only experience what you believe. There's a part of the brain called the reticular activating system that has a unique function. So it's important to realize that from a sensory perspective, it's been estimated that there are, let's say, 200 million pieces, little bite-sized bits of sensory input that's coming into our lives at any and every moment of our lives. So we don't have the ability to give our attention and our focus to that many different things. So classic example of this is if I were to tell you right now, I want you to think about your right big toe, and I want you to feel and sense and pay attention to what your big toe is feeling. Or I want you to sense into your body right now, and I want you to notice where you feel some unease or where you feel some tension. Now, unless you stubbed your toe or broke your toe, unless it's screaming in pain, more than likely you were sitting here listening to me, focused on this, maybe focused on something else that you're doing as you're listening or as you're watching, but you probably weren't thinking about your right big toe. But as soon as I said something, you're able to draw your attention there, or draw your attention to where you have tension. And there you go. You were able to experience it. Prior to that, it was there, it was feeling, it was sensing, but because your attention wasn't drawn to it, you weren't experiencing the experience that your right big toe was having. You see what I'm saying? So it's about attention. This is all about attention. Attention is key here. What are you paying attention to? So the truth is, if we've got millions of pieces of information coming into us from all the different feelings that we're sensing in our bodies, around our bodies, the temperature, the air, everything that's within our field of vision, even the things that are out of focus right now, I can shift my focus and look over here, and I can notice things in the corner of the room over here. I can experience them. They were there all along, but because my attention wasn't there, I didn't experience them. Now, you can consciously shift your attention, which is super important. We're going to talk about that as well, because that's key, essential to experiencing these things. But you have a part of your brain called the reticular activating system that I mentioned earlier that functions as a filter for this stuff, that takes hold of your attention and automatically and subconsciously is filtering out the vast majority of information that's there. Now, I'm talking about the physical world here. I'm not even talking about the subtle world of spirit. I'm talking about the dense physical world in which we live, 200 million pieces of information coming at you, and you can't pay attention to them all at once. So the reticular activating system eliminates almost all of that. and only keeps you focused on what's important, what's vital to your biological survival. So a lot of us have experienced a shift in our reticular activating system when we buy a new car. Do you remember PT Cruisers? Remember those little PT Cruisers that came out that kind of looked like 1950s mob boss cars or something like that? And there was actually a psychological reason that they built them that way as a marketing tool. And I remember going to look at some cars, and somebody showed us a purple PT Cruiser, and I love the color purple. And I thought, man, this is unique. And I have something in my personality that just doesn't like homogenization. Like, it's frustrating to me how homogenized the world has become. I see these apartment complexes going up, or even housing developments, new neighborhoods and housing developments going up, and it's the same house block after block after block. The apartments are all the same, the condos are all the same. You go out today, I love the 70s and the 80s, and when cars, you had different makes, different models, different colors, and everybody kind of had their own personality with that. Now it's just homogenized, right? Everything's kind of box shaped, everything kind of looks the same. You got primarily silver, black, white, maybe there's some blue cars out there, but you just don't, if you see a red car, a yellow car, a purple car, it really kind of stands out now. And so we end up buying this purple PT Cruiser, and I think I'm getting something that is unique, right? That's kind of taking me back to the 70s and the 80s when you had, your style car. Some of you know what I'm talking about. And much to my dismay, as I'm driving around town, I notice, wow, imagine this, in a attempt to make money, Chrysler developed on their assembly line thousands of purple PT Cruisers. So when I'm buying the car, I think I'm getting something unique. But when I'm driving the car, I'm seeing one everywhere that I hadn't seen before. Why? Because when I bought one, when I became invested in it, emotionally, financially, and it became the vehicle that I was driving, my reticular activating system adjusted to that. So now I'm noticing and seeing or experiencing, if you will, every purple PT Cruiser that's out there. So that gives you an idea how the reticular activating system works. There are things out there in our environment that we never experience because the reticular activating system just completely filters those out. Now, if that's true of our physical senses, because the truth is they estimate you can only focus consciously on about anywhere from 5 to 9 things at once. And by things, I mean sensory input. I'm not even talking about like multitasking. I'm just talking out of the millions of information that's out there. All of it gets filtered out except for about 5 to 7 pieces that we can focus on in any given moment. So consequently, if you do not believe, if you are a scientific materialist and you believe that this physical world is all there is, and that our consciousness is simply the byproduct of the electrical and chemical activities that are going on in our brain that is creating our consciousness, and you don't believe there's anything else, then that it could be standing right in front of you and you're not going to experience it because your beliefs are going to filter that out. So if you don't have any belief in that, you're not going to experience it at all, which is going to leave you stuck in this loop of self-confirming bias and confirmation bias, because I believe the material world is all there is. Therefore, the material world is all I experience. And because the material world is all I experience, I know the material world is all there is. It's no different than the circular reasoning. I crack up because these guys go out there and they'll slam on Christians that believe in the Bible because you believe the Bible is inspired by God because the Bible says it's inspired by God. And since the Bible says it's inspired by God, you believe it's inspired by God. It's circular reasoning. It's the same thing with materialism. I believe this material world, this natural world is all there is. Therefore, this natural world is all I experience. And because this natural world is all I experience, I know this natural world is all there is. And if there is something else out there, well, I don't know about it and I didn't experience it, right? So you're completely blocked off because of your belief. So first primary importance is believing. Now, what do you say, Aaron? Well, I've never experienced it and I don't believe in it, but I want to. Well, good news. You can try this out. You can try just shifting that belief. And I'm not saying I'm going to try this and see if it works necessarily in the sense of a short term, but say try, I'm going to try and reprogram my brain. I'm going to be open to the fact that there is spiritual stuff out there. There is unseen stuff out there, that I am a spiritual being, that I can connect with the spiritual world. I'm going to believe that. And so I'm going to rehearse that over and over again to myself in my mind. I'm just determined. I want to believe in a spiritual world. I'm going to believe in a spiritual world. But then you have to believe that that spiritual world is accessible, and not just accessible to anyone. You have to believe that it's accessible to you, that you can access it if you learn how, that you can experience it if you learn how. And then by experiencing it, then you can bring the pragmatic side to it. Is this real, or is this working? Is this benefiting me? Is this helping me in any way in my life? And if it's not, after trying this for, give it 6 months to a year of really engaging in some of these principles that I'm going to tell you. And if you don't experience anything after 6 months to a year, and you've really applied yourself, you haven't just tried it, well, let's just wait and see what happens. You've been very intentional about it and still nothing's happened. Then by all means, go back to whatever was working for you before. The point is, if you don't believe in it, you're not going to experience it. Your reticular activating system is going to block all that stuff out. All right, so that's first. Second thing, you have to believe in it. You have to believe, let me just emphasize this, you have to believe it's also for you. In other words, if it's out there, I believe I also am a spirit being, and I believe that I can access it. So the way this worked for me was I would read about encounters that other people had. I would read about stories that other people had. And instead of just being skeptical and cynical about it and just saying, I don't know about any of that stuff, I would take them at their word. Wow, these people have experienced this. I want to experience this. How did these people experience this? If I can learn how they experienced it and I can do the same things, then I believe I can experience it as well. So that's where that began for me. The second thing we've already kind of talked about, and that is attention. This is where I think the shamanic worldview and shamanic practices are really helpful and really powerful. So when I say shamanic, what I mean by that is there are some basic principles that are true in all shamanic cultures across all time periods. Just some basic principles. There's certainly some differences, but some of the basic principles are that they believe that we are dreaming our reality, and that there are spiritual helpers out there and spiritual beings, and that everything that manifests in the material is rooted somewhere in the spiritual. So for every effect that we experience in our lives, there is a cause that originates in the spiritual world. And they tend to divide the spiritual world into 3 different levels. There's the earthly plane in its spiritual nature, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then beneath that is the underworld. And this isn't hell like in the traditional Christian sense, but there is an underworld. There's energies that originate from the earth. The underworld is a place oftentimes where you can meet loved ones who've gone on all kinds of different stuff. It's not my purpose to do a real in-depth talk on this. And then the third realm is this higher realm of higher spirits, where you can get guidance and spiritual wisdom and things like this. And so they've got these 3 planes: the spiritual reality of the world in which we live, the present moment; the underworld, which has its own population of spiritual helpers, and the upper world, which has its own population of spiritual helpers. The reason this is helpful is because it can guide attention. So if anybody's ever heard of shamanic journeying, if anybody's ever done shamanic journeying, what that facilitates for a person is attention. So you can go on your own sort of spontaneous shamanic journey by saying, I'm going to put my attention on the higher realms, the lower realm, the middle realm, or oftentimes they're guided by someone who's more experienced and someone who's more practiced, right? The point is focus of attention. This is also why meditation can help, because meditation, a couple things that meditation do, even if you're approaching meditation from a strictly secular point of view, materialist point of view, a couple of things that meditation does that can assist us in our ability to connect with spirit is that it mutes temporarily, at least, or it subdues, maybe that's a better way to say it, subdues temporarily, at least, our attention being focused primarily on the external world. So I close my eyes. Maybe I get into a quiet place where sounds aren't going to bother me, or perhaps I put on some quiet, soft music or something like that so that I'm distracted from auditory senses. And I try to relax. I try to let go. I try to go within. So I'm muting or shutting out my attention on the physical biological world. And then I'm drawing my attention. If you want to go one step further in meditation, I'm drawing my attention towards spiritual reality, spiritual energy. So number one is belief. Number two is attention. Where are you putting your attention? You have to give attention. You have to pay for this. You have to pay for this. You have to pay attention. And you have to pay attention within, which brings me to the third thing that's important, and that is engaging with what Henry Corbin called the imaginal realm. Now, it's very similar to the imagination, but it's also different. So the imaginal realm is the realm that I tapped into when I was sitting on that beach. See, imagination is just anything I can come up with in my mind. And I can see it if I have that ability, which most people do. There are some people that just don't seem to be able to make pictures in their mind, or their imagination doesn't function that way. I'll get to that in a second. For example, I could focus on a picture of Jesus, whatever I think Jesus looks like, and I can put that out there. And that's all my imagination. I'm totally creating that, totally building that within me. No different than if I imagined Harry Potter or Darth Vader or any what we would typically consider to be a fictional character, right? But then there comes a point where it takes on a life of its own. I'm no longer generating it. It takes on a life of its own. So when Jesus is walking to me, when he hands me the little lamb, I'm now crossed over from the imagination realm, the strictly imagination, where I'm creating it, to the imaginal realm, where something now higher is wiser, is interacting with me on that plane or on that level. So developing the imagination. So I want to just touch on some keys here, and then I'm going to have to be done because I wanted to keep this to an hour. But if you're interested, I'll come back on and talk about some other things. But if you get these three things, this will give you a good foundation. Belief, your attention, putting your attention off of this world out here and putting it within, and then engaging in the imagination, because this, maybe more than anything else, is what robs people of real spiritual guidance and real spiritual experience and real spiritual empowerment, is they think they're making it up. It's just me. It's just my mind. It's just my imagination. When we were, back in the Christian circles, how do I know if it's God, if it's me, or if it's the devil, right? I'm making this up. And that comes out of this Cartesian split in this Western worldview in which we live. In shamanic cultures, indigenous cultures, they wouldn't ask that question, am I making it up? Because they don't have categories for that. But we've been so brainwashed to think in a certain way, according to scientific materialism and really laws of physics that are outdated and have been disproven in laboratories doing quantum physics investigations. But again, that's a whole other video in and of itself. So we think, well, I'm just making this up. Well, the reality is you're making it all up. This is true. You're making it all up. In other words, one of the interesting things about our perceptual, the way we see, some people don't see color, right? A lot of us do see color, but as stuff's coming in, it would seem that the image is upside down, that as the brain's recording that information, it's upside down, but your brain, your mind flips it right side up. That's all coming from within you. The color that you see isn't out there. It's a certain pattern that your brain is picking up, and then it creates the color that you see. That's why some people are color blind, right? You see what I'm saying? So that's a big obstacle. Oh, I must just be making this up. So I want to talk about the clairs. The clairs. What are the clairs? Most people are probably familiar with the term clairvoyant. Clairvoyant. It's a French word, I believe. The word clair means clear, voyant means vision, clear seeing. So what we might typically call the imagination. So when I'm seeing Jesus on the beach, when I'm seeing the Lamb, when I'm seeing whatever images are coming into my world now, because I have belief and I've given my attention to it and I've engaged the imagination realm. So whatever's coming in, people who see their loved ones, or they can see your loved ones, psychic that can see your loved ones, or they can see the future, or they can see remote viewing would be a great example of this. This would be clairvoyance, clear seeing. But that's not the only way to perceive, any more than just having vision, unless you're deaf and you don't have any feeling or taste or smell. Seeing is not your only way of connecting and making sense of the world. We have ears, we have nerve endings, we have the ability to feel. So clairvoyance is strictly talking about images and pictures and seeing. There's a second one, there's a second clair called clairaudience. This is the ability to hear sounds from spiritual planes. So some people hear music. Some people hear vibrations. Some people hear a voice speaking to them. That would be an example of clairaudience. They connect mostly with what they hear. I hear my spirit guides. I hear my ancestors. I hear, like I said, music or sounds, vibrations, whatever. The third one is claircognizance. So clairvoyance, clear seeing, clairaudience, clear hearing. Claircognizance has to do with cognition. This has to do with thoughts. So information from that realm might primarily come to you through your thoughts. You're just thinking, and all of a sudden a train of thought starts. We might call it a download, but it's a train of thought that is insightful, that is expansive, that is teaching, that is giving you information that you don't know ordinarily, that kind of interrupts your ordinary flow of thinking. That's called claircognizance. And then the last one that I want to talk about is called clairsentience. Clairsentience, sentimental, has to do, with the feeling realm. Sorry about that. Has to do with the feeling realm. I can feel things. I just feel a certain way. I can feel what other people are going through. Empaths experience this. I can feel subtle energies around me. I can feel the presence of stuff around me. And you've got to know all of us probably have a primary one. Now, unless you are called into this work, unless this is a vocation for you, the word calling might be too triggering for some people. The word vocation, vocal, calling, um, unless you're going into some kind of vocation of working with this stuff, it's probably not necessary to work to develop all four of the clairs. A person can, I believe, particularly if they're called into this work. They'll see, they'll hear, they'll have downloads in their thoughts, they'll sense and they'll feel stuff. But for the average person, you probably have one or two that are dominant for you. And this probably connects to how well you learn. So you might ask yourself, what is my learning style? How do I learn? Do you learn primarily by seeing it? If I see it, I can get it. That is not my primary learning style. It drives me nuts, completely nuts today, to have to assemble this RTA, this ready to assemble furniture, and pull out the directions, and there's no words. It's all just pictures. Now, fortunately, I've been blessed with a son who is very good visual learner. He's very good spatially, has a very high IQ, very high spatial IQ. And so I can just hand it to him and he can put it together in nothing flat, right? I mean, he can do all those puzzles and Legos and all that stuff, but I look at it, it's just like it's not connecting with me because I'm not primarily a visual learner. So I'm primarily an auditory learner. I learn by listening, I learn by reading. So if I can read the directions, it's much easier for me to put something together than if I see the directions. If I hear something one time, used to be, as I get older, not as sharp as I used to be for sure, but I used to be able to hear something one time, read something one time, and pretty much I'd have it. People say, how do you have all this information? It's because I definitely don't have a photographic memory. That would be visual, but I do, to a certain degree, have an auditory sort of photographic memory, if you will, although, like I said. So maybe you learn primarily through listening. Maybe you're a kinesthetic learner. So a kinesthetic learner is someone who learns by doing. I've got to do it. I've got to have somebody do it with me. One of my children really had a trouble with like the ABCs, counting to 10, all that stuff, getting all that stuff sequentially. Tried flashcards, you sing your ABCs, all of that. It wasn't working. All it took was one day with a sand tray and have him write out the alphabet with his finger in a sand tray. And once he wrote out the alphabet with his finger in a sand tray, it was locked in. He had it. Well, what does that tell me? That tells me that he's a kinesthetic learner. At least that's one of his strong areas of learning is kinesthetic. Unfortunately, schools aren't set up too much for kinesthetic learners, but trade fields certainly are. Trades certainly are. So his vocation might have more to do with a trade than with, say, a college degree, simply because his learning style is very kinesthetic. So that's where the sentience comes in, the sensing. So do you see? Do you think? Do you hear? Do you feel? Some people have to think something through. They almost have to talk it out, if you will, before they know what they think. They have to process verbally. They have to process externally. A lot of those people are cognizant learners. They learn by thinking it through, problem solving, stuff like that. And so if you can identify what your primary learning style is, then it's going to be easier for you to translate that into experiences in the imaginal realm. Even though it has the word image in it, it doesn't necessarily mean just pictures. It can, again, mean sounds, music, vibrations. It can mean voices that you hear. It can mean, or you can be more internally, if you're always in your head and you're a thinker and you're this is called an auditory digital. Technically, it's called auditory digital. I'm hearing my thoughts, but I know they're my thoughts. It's different than hearing other people in the imaginal realm, or you see what I'm saying? If that's the way, then try tapping into that. If you're a feeler, you're a kinesthetic learner, pay more attention to what you're feeling. You might feel subtle energies. Now, here's the other thing. This is the last thing I want to talk about. And then I need to go because of time. And like I said, I can follow this up. But the last thing I want to talk about is that keep in mind that when we're talking about things that are spiritual in origin and spiritual in nature, that they are more subtle than gross or heavy, not gross like sick, but uh, so matter would be considered gross. What's coming into our senses, what we see from this material world, it's very dense, very solid, very apparent. Spiritual things are not like that. Spiritual things are detected internally by clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, claircognizance. So you're going to think it's you, but it's not you. It's just how you're detecting, right? Just like I could say it wasn't me that handed me a lamp and said, "Hey, you need to look at this." That I didn't originate that. I didn't make that up. That didn't come from me. That came from a source external to me through clairvoyance, through clairsentience. So I'm saying I didn't hear anything. I didn't get any thoughts. It was strictly clairvoyance, and then I felt it when I took the lamb, and I felt all those things. Clairsentience. You see what I'm saying? Was it me? Well, yeah, in the same way that what I see is me, what I hear is me from this world. But here's the last point I want to make. This one's really important. The spiritual realm is more subtle. It's finer, if you will. It's thinner. So a lot of people miss the supernatural because they're looking for the spectacular. They want to hear God, but they think they're going to hear God in the fireworks, not in the whisper. They want to see something spectacular. They want to see something that's really going to awe them or wow them. And if it doesn't come in that way, if I don't see Jesus sitting next to me or standing in front of me, like I can see my wife and kids or my friends or my coworkers standing in front of me, then I can't accept it as real. So they miss the supernatural because they're seeking the spectacular. And they dismiss the subtle. Oh, that's just me. Oh, that's just my imagination. And what I've learned is that that which is spiritual in origin is, again, it's more subtle. It's thinner. It's what the Bible called the still small voice. If you remember the story, those of you that know your Bible stories, you remember the story of Elijah. He went in the mountain and there's a whirlwind, but God's not in the whirlwind. And there's a fire, but God's not in the fire. And there's an earthquake, but God's not in the earthquake. And then all of a sudden it says, there came a still small voice, the whisper of God. It came very subtly. I'll give you an example, last example that I'll share, and then I'll go. Um, when the first time I ever operated in what we would call a word of knowledge in regards to healing. So word of knowledge in regards to healing is like psychic healing. It's like where you know a condition about someone without being told. You just know it. And the way we would do this is call that out and and more often than not every time, and I don't know why not every time, but more often than not, the person with that condition would also receive healing. So the first time this happened to me was in a church service, and it was during the song section of the service that we used to call praise and worship. And very subtly, very briefly, just for a moment, a picture popped into my mind of well, I thought it was left ear. It must have been the way it was positioned on the paper, but a book, an encyclopedia or an anatomy book that had an article about the ear and how the ear works. That's all I saw. It was like a page on a piece of paper from an article flashed into my brain. And I could have easily ignored that. There was no goosebumps. There was no energy presence. There was no booming voice. There was no clear vision. No, just a flash of a picture. And I thought, well, that's unusual for me to, but see, I noticed it. I paid attention to it. That's unusual for me to see that. And then I built on that. What's this about? I've been asking for words of knowledge. Could this be a word of knowledge? Well, there's only one way to know. And the only way to know is to stand up and say, call it out. So I interrupted the song service. I was leading the service, so I wasn't being inappropriate. And I said, there's someone here with a problem in your left ear. And then I added this part, the Lord wants to heal you of that problem. And a few seconds later, a woman comes down the aisle crying. And she had been deaf in her left ear for, I want to say, more than a decade, because a firecracker when she was younger had gone off in her ear and blew up the eardrum or whatever. I don't know what happened there. But after that, she wasn't able to hear, and the loss of hearing in her left ear had left her tone deaf. Now, and she was healed. She testified to being healed, and she absolutely was healed. Now, let me tell you the backstory of it, because the backstory is really fascinating. The week prior, I had preached a message called "I'm Getting My Vision Back." And by vision, I meant your goal for who you are in your future. You can see a version of yourself on a different timeline in the future. And I talked about reclaiming it. And this woman loved to sing, and she had a beautiful voice. But after this incident with the firecracker, as I said, it left her tone deaf, so she wasn't able to sing. And this message the week before had really touched her. And we had choir practice the following Saturday. And so she decided by faith that she was going to join the choir, even though she knew she couldn't sing. She went to the choir practice. She didn't participate. She just observed and said she'd like to be part of it. She comes back to church the following week. And while she's sitting in service, I call out, there's someone here with problems in your left ear, and the Lord wants to heal you. And her little girl looked at her and said, Mommy, that's you. And so she got up and out of her seat, and she began to come down, because I called them forward. I said, if you're here, come forward. Let's see what the Lord does. And as she's walking up, before anybody prays for her, before I pray for her, before anything happens, as she's walking up to the front of the service, her ear pops open and she was able to hear clearly, and she was able to become a part of our choir. She sang some solo specials at like Christmas time and stuff like that. And the healing was stabilized. It stayed. It stuck with her. All of that was at play. None of that, the last part of that, the healing miracle, at least as far as I'm concerned, and some of you may disagree with this, but how many people have you prayed for that have been healed like that? It's my belief that we all have a part to play in this. The Bible calls it the working of miracles, not just miracles. And it's my belief that if I'd have ignored that picture, because it was so subtle, it was so brief, it was so quick, if I had ignored it and not called it out, I have to wonder, would she have received her miracle right then? Now, she may have gotten it later, but I'm not sure. I could have easily ignored it. I could have easily blown it off. But here's this woman who steps out in faith, gets her vision back, gets her gift restored to her, gets healed, and as a result of that, something that she so enjoyed was given back to her. All because I paid attention to the subtle. The spectacular happened when she told the testimony and she told the story. It sounds spectacular, but really, it was very, very subtle. Sometimes we miss God because we look for him in the fireworks and not the whisper. So, belief, attention, imagination, and paying attention to the subtle. If you'll start doing those 4 things and you'll commit to it and really practice it, and really work with it, you'll start to see these kinds of things. You'll start to connect with your spirit guides, with your higher power, with your higher self, with spirit, and you'll start to experience these things for yourself. Totally convinced of that. So whatever time you're watching this, I hope it's great for you. I hope you have a great rest of your day if you're watching live, if you're watching by replay, afternoon, evening, whatever time's appropriate to you based on the time and location that you're watching this. God bless you. Love you. Thank you for spending time with me. And I'll see you again later.